program for today. We are going to get an introduction about the context and the relevance of the topic from Ms. Lena Kaczmarski from GIZ. And after that, we are going to take a closer look at the content of the policy brief and the discussions, the findings, and in fact, the topic. So our colleague Raju Pandit-Chetri will give us a little bit more insights on the lessons learned so far and on the process that is going to negotiate the future climate finance goal. And Raju will be followed by Michael Köhler and Sven Hamerling, who both will give a little bit more technical insights on how such a goal could look like and where the crunching issues are. We aim to take some 25-30 minutes for these presentations, and then afterwards we are opening the floor to everybody so that we can have a nice discussion, questions and answers. For now, for the housekeeping, as I said before, please close your microphones and also disable your video signal. We are going to allow the questions through the either through your microphone or through the chat after the presentation. So keep your questions, please. Then we will have enough time for discussion, and then you can shoot them through the chat, or you can also ask questions. For that, please then raise your hand, and then we can see that you have an issue to discuss. Okay, with that, I would leave it, and I would give the floor to Lena Kaczmarski. Lena is team lead climate finance and mitigation with GIZ, and she's in the climate policy support program. And at GIZ, besides a lot of work on climate finance, she has also been working in Peru, in the Peruvian context on the ground on climate finance. And I'm happy that you are joining us, Lena, today, and the floor is yours for an introduction.
Thank you very much, Björn, for the introduction and the welcome. I'd also like to wish to welcome everyone who's already on board with this webinar. It's a very special occasion for us, but also it's a very usual occasion because we've been working together with CFAS consortium for the last 4 years. We just did some digging, Johanna Helms and me, who's also in the call, who has been cooperating very closely with you on the development of this fact sheet and the 1 billion fact sheets as well. So I think it has been in the past years, it has been a very fruitful collaboration and cooperation with you. And so we are very happy to repeat this every year, and I'm also willing to repeat this the following year. And I would also like to send the regards from the BMZ, from our ministry, because the Climate Finance Policy Support Program is, of course, financed by the ministry. And our goal is to help and serve the climate community with basic knowledge on climate finance. And so I can say that we are happy that every year we are able to publish at least 1 to 2 policy briefs on climate finance topics, especially also for GIZ and BMZ. It's very important to support the negotiators and interested public in developing countries, especially for the negotiations, but also to broaden the knowledge on climate finance. You know that it's can be very complicated and it can be very nitty and gritty, these kind of topics. So we are so happy that every year CFAS is able to do this work with us. And still, this year is an unusual year, maybe not such a happy year for climate and climate finance, but still we thought it would be nice and useful to go ahead with these topics and take some first steps on discussing and elaborating possible options for the post-2025 climate finance goal. We actually discussed maybe half a year ago with the CFAS consortium, with Germanwatch and the other organizations, if this is necessary, if it's useful, if we should and wait and see. But then we decided, no, we have to go on climate change doesn't stop. We have to keep discussing and bring together the community and have these kind of webinars, especially on these technical issues. And so there is a momentum. We have had the November dialogues and the 5-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement in a couple of days is in front of our doorsteps, and we don't want to have another lost year. So that's why we actually thought, no, we have to go on with developing and elaborating these kind of policy briefs, and we are committed to keep doing so. At the same time, I would like to stress our role as GIZ for BMZ. We are also part of the EU negotiation group. So in that regard, maybe not all of the opinions expressed in these papers are all the opinions GIZ has or BMZ has. But I think that having said, for us at GIZ, it's very important to have these kind of policy briefs, because our developing country partners, institutions, and members of these institutions are always very interested in these kind of topics. And I think we know that over the last years, we've had very positive feedback on these policy briefs. And I would also like to say one last comment about this policy brief. Of course, it talks about options for the post-2025 climate finance goal. But what I liked especially about this part is it looks into the future, but without being the crystal ball, because it's based on what has been discussed over the last years, since Copenhagen practically. So I think it's not looking into the future, predicting miracles, but it takes a very interesting approach on discussing the possible options, also looking into the qualitative criteria and qualitative options. So I think that's very fascinating, and I think we will be discussing this a lot further next year. And I hope that the COVID situation will we'll have a solution over the couple of next months, so that we can actually see each other again with the ESBs or the COP26. Thank you very much for organizing this, and I would also like to send a special thanks to my colleague Johanna Helms, who has been collaborating with CFAS to get this paper out. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Lena, for these warm opening words. Indeed, a very fascinating topic, and it was a pleasure to work on this. And with that, I would like to now start discussing the content. Our colleague Raju Pandit Chetri from the Prakriti Resource Center in Nepal. I hope that was correct. Raju, you are a seasoned and very veteran and experienced negotiator in climate finance, and we are so happy to have you with CFAS. You bring in a very important perspective also from the developing world. So you are going to talk us through the process and the relevant milestones and lessons learned. Happy to hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Bjorn. I hope I'm clear. And namaste to everyone from Kathmandu. I will just take you very briefly through the process of this setting this new collective quantified goal on climate finance. You know, the process we started not this year or last year, but it's been quite some time. It goes all the way back to the Paris Agreement in 2015 when this decision was made. In fact, this is something very critical because, and lots of developing countries really look forward to this because the kind of experience that we have come from the 100 billion goal that was set up almost a decade back, that has given some kind of experience, which I will talk briefly later. But the mandate does come from the COP21, asking CMA to define a goal that's before 2025. In order to have a more scientific or more relevant target in terms of climate finance. Because this is something, it also talks that not only requests the CMA to have a goal before 2025, but it talks about based on the needs and priorities of the developing countries. And in fact, on a progression, it means that building on from the 100 billion goal that has been committed until now. But then, of course, the COP21 did not really decide on when the process will start. In fact, this decision came in CMA1 at Katowice at COP24. What it said basically was that at its CMA's third session, CMA, which literally means Conference of the Parties, serving as a meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement, or a body that CMA is a body that primarily looks for the progress and the implementation of the Paris Agreement, that it decided that a new goal, setting this new target, new goal would start at CMA3, which is supposed to be this year, in fact, in 2020. But of course, we know that due to the COVID-19 that the COP has been postponed next year. It means that we have lost a year in discussing this. So hopefully there will be a decision next year and the process will begin. In fact, though this decision is taken, there's not been much discussion around how this is going to be set up or how the discussion actually is going to take place. There was some kind of discussion took place under APA, ad hoc working group under the Paris Agreement, which ended, of course, in 2018 again at Katowice COP. But that there was some discussion also took place under long-term finance, where some experience were being brought up. But other than that, basically in the current year, where the incoming and the outgoing presidency are just discussing on understanding various perspectives, not much has been done. Next. So just in order to build on this, Christine, can you go to the next one? Just let me just very briefly talk on the lessons learned from the 100 billion goal. We know that the 100 billion goal was set up or agreed in at COP15 in 2009 in Copenhagen. So when this goal was in fact decided, initially it was it said there was a two-part. One was the short-term finance, or the what they call it, $30 billion for 3 years from 2010 to 2012. But that would increase all the way to 100 billion per year by 2020, and this is the year where they are supposed to meet. But we know from the OECD recent report that only about in 2018, only about not more than 80 billion, or let's say in fact $78 billion were only provided. But with these numbers increasing over the years, there's not been a very good experience, I would say. In other terms, I would say that there's a lot of lessons to be learned, because when this number was decided in Copenhagen, it was more arbitrary number. It was not based on a scientific assessment. There was a lot of assessment that already said developing countries would require a lot more money just for adaptation alone, not even accounting the mitigation side. Of course, the loss and damage was not even in sight then. So it means the 100 billion goal that was more a political number was more of an arbitrary number. But when that number started being implemented and then going forward, there's a lot of tension as well. Like when these numbers started being, now we are at the stage of even receiving the 4th biennial assessment report. We said that a lot of these numbers come in duplication with the ODA. There's a lot of loan being provided. It means that the money that is given to the developing countries are going back to the developed country, so on and so forth. So that learning has been, and that tension is still exists in the negotiations. But in order to avoid this, that the number doesn't become arbitrary, it is not a political number, but it is based on science, that the collective decision-making process is a very important aspect. In order to decide on this, so that all the countries have that confidence that they were consulted and it was agreed numbers. So that process needs to be learned for this post 2025 numbers. So I think this is some of the very basic or important lessons that we have learned from the past 100 billion process. And next, Christine. So just going to the process forward, we know as I said, the process started in 2025. We are supposed to decide this, the process of going forward in now not in 2020, but in 2021, and probably we should decide this in 2024. It means that we have almost 3 years time frame to discuss this thoroughly when it starts in 2022. But in order to have numbers, we have both the external processes and the internal process. When I talk about the external processes, I'm basically talking about out of the UNFCCC process. It means that that whenever these climate finance demands are being met, developed countries always say that, we have our own system, we have our parliament, we have our own policies that we need to follow, and we cannot just come to a number and provide finance. So I think this process, starting early, gives ample opportunity for the developed countries to align this with their national processes or the parliamentary requirements or whatever national rules that they have. For instance, Germany has its own rules, United States and other countries have their own rules to go through their parliament in order to agree on a certain budget. But having said that, there's also the internal process. There are a lot of things already designed within the Paris Agreement that allows this process to be informed. For instance, the Article 4 of the Paris Agreement that talks about preparing NDCs. And this is also the year where all the countries are asked to prepare enhanced NDC until with the target for 2025, for 5 years. It means that with this process, there will also be some kind of costing being done or assessment being done. Similarly, there is this Article 13 on the transparency framework, enhanced transparency framework. This article gives requests for information both from the developed and developing countries. For the developed countries, it's about the resources, how much they have mobilized or provided. For the developing countries, what is the need and what they have received actually, the support they have received. Similarly, there's also the GST process, and in global stocktake process, it is the Article 14 of the Paris Agreement, and in 2023 that is going to take place. So it means even under this, it is to be informed that how the progress on the Paris Agreement implementation is actually being done. So including the financial processes. Also on the financial flows, which is the Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, it basically means that making financial flow consistent with the pathways towards low carbon and climate resilient development. And this is the article. Of course, it's very, it's not yet articulate how this actually will be seen. But when the Katowice decision was made at COP24, when it refers to the decision for the post-2025 climate finance goal, what it refers to is, in fact, it also had some language related to the 2.1c. But of course, we are yet to see how this is going to unfold. But other than that part, we have a regular process where the SCF is always every 2 years coming out with a biennial assessment report. But this year, which are supposed to come, but probably it won't this year, but it'll come in 2021 as the need assessment report as well. So these process has to be also taken into account. Now, just in order to explain how this goes, and my final slide would be, Christine, if you go to the next one. Yes, so if you just see this in various processes, that the new goal that we're going to set up, at least before 2024, I would say, or at least by 2024, in order to get into action by 2025, the whole process has to be taken into a comprehensive or in a holistic manner. That it is not being arbitrary like what we did in 2009. That this is being informed by the NDCs. This is being informed by the biennial transparency reports under the Article 13. Similarly, the global stocktake, and also the processes. Now, if you see, the many developing countries are preparing NAPs, for instance. You know, they're going to cost their adaptation financing under the national adaptation plans. Some countries in the past already did LDCs already did NAPAs, for instance, National Adaptation Program of Action. There's also this reports coming out every 2 years in different form. As I said, the similar documents or the process that I explained earlier about where this NDCs coming every 5 years, GST taking place every 5 years. There's also this biennial transparency report coming out every 2 years, and then also the need assessment, which is going to start next year, and then again we have it in 2025 again. So this is a comprehensive way to really look into these processes and say that what kind of finance we actually will be needed in order to meet the requirement of the developing countries. I know now when we say this, there could be a lot of processes. Now the decision on the at the Katowice decision basically talks about a deliberation at the on the post 2025 goal. Now there's always a big question about what this deliberation means. You know, you can always articulate. For the negotiators, we know how they play with words, and they have to be really good wordsmith to really articulate this and unpack this word. We don't yet know what this deliberation will be and how this deliberation will actually take place. Will it be inclusive? Will it be, I know the process will be clearly defined so that everybody has an ownership in this process, unlike what happened in 2009. So if we do not take that pathway of making it a very technical assessment based on science, which is very scientifically robust, based on the needs and the priorities of the developing countries, again, there is a fear that we might end up with what we did in 2009. So what I would say finally is, in order to take this forward, this process, whatever number we agree in 2024, has to be informed by science and the needs of the developing countries, but that is acceptable to all the parties to the Paris Agreement, so that there is a trust-building process going forward in terms of really taking climate actions in all the countries. Only doing that process will allow for us to move into a right direction. There's ownership, and the climate action actually will take place, and then we will go towards solving probably this climate crisis. I will end there and probably hand it over to Michael, and then we'll continue our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Raju, for explaining the background of the negotiation process. Since the COP21 decision only stipulates a floor of the 100 billion and requires progression beyond previous efforts, various key technical elements of the post-2025 goal remain actually unspecified. This means interpretations and options are likely prone to contentious discussions and negotiations in the upcoming months and years. Thus, in our policy brief, we also focused a lot on the discussion of the goal's technical elements and options to operationalize those. Hereby, we took into account the lessons learned from the kind of parallel policy brief we have developed on the lessons learned of the 100 billion goal, but also views from CSOs, researchers, and UNFCCC parties that were available. The first question I would like to address is the one of the goal's time frame. The question is, can single-year targets be applied, or are medium-term corridors until, for example, the mid-2030s are useful? From our analysis, a lot here speaks towards another 5-year cycle, as we have seen it also for the current 100 billion goal from 2020 to 2025, maybe initially then for the period until 2030. And why is that also so? First of all, we just heard from Raju that a lot of other UNFCCC processes can be actually well aligned to the goal process, such as the biennial transparency reports, the global stocktake, or the needs determination reports of the standing committee. They have also similar timeframes that could fit to such a 5-year cycle. And secondly, the second half of the 2020s will be very, very decisive for achieving the long-term mitigation targets, as we have learned from the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees. Therefore, there is a lot of need for additional resources for the developing countries, particularly in this second half of the 2020s. Next, Christina. Next question would be, how does the goal actually looks like? There is no clear definition yet. The current climate finance goal we have with 100 billion includes the characteristics of being a quantifiable absolute number. It's 100 billion, and it has a predefined currency in US dollars and a clear reference date with the year 2020. So an absolute number in a defined currency with a reference date that follows up on this approach might be the most likely option. Hereby, we have also seen that in this context, a fixed currency from a large economy such as the United States or potentially also the EU suggests a robust hedge against economic crisis. We have, for example, just seen that during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so this would help to keep such a strong currency. But alternatively, also a roadmap with several intermediate goals might be possible that would most likely support enhancing transparency and trust in such a goal, particularly if it covers a longer time frame. So this relates to the first question somehow. And many countries have also applied similar approaches for defining their long-term greenhouse gas emission reductions. So it's not uncommon in the climate policy world to have such roadmaps. Finally, there might also be another option of interpreting quantitative as rather a relative share, as a percentage. This share could, for example, be related to the developing countries' conditional NDC finance requirements they communicate, or the funding needs for greenhouse gas mitigation and adaptation, or the contributor countries' respective capacities. We know that here, for example, from the ODA goal, which relates to 0.7% of the GDP that shall be provided for developing countries. A final question here on this slide is, or an aspect that we considered in the policy brief, is uncertainties that affect the goal's promise. Here we see on the one hand that economies develop dynamically and often interrupted by disruptive events, such as, for example, the 28-29 financial crisis, or right now, the COVID-19 pandemic. We see that the needs now differ significantly, the needs of the developing countries differ significantly from before 2020. So there was a total of the needs category, and countries require massive publicly financed recovery measures followed by typically significantly increased state debt levels. This can jeopardize urgently needed climate action investments, potentially even over the next decades. And this makes international support even more important at this point of time. And this line of argument would suggest to allow for frequent readjustments of the new goal. So not going for too long time spans, but rather give the opportunity to readjust. And then also ramped up climate finance flows that go beyond the 100 billion provided in the scope of this new goal would require appropriate frameworks and environments on the recipient country's side, that the money can also be used effectively on the ground. And for that, countries need such frameworks, and some countries such as LDCs or SIDS might need additional technical assistance to also establish such suitable frameworks for all sectors. Next slide, Christine. With regards to accounting rules, we see that one major reason for disappointments among CSOs and developing party constituencies in the context of the 100 billion was the Paris Agreement's vague definition of mobilizing funds from a wide variety of sources, instruments, and channels. What we have seen here is that there is only limited guidance on methodologies for tracking climate finance flows that are partly differently interpreted by different parties, and institutions apply different systems, such, for example, the MDBs that use another system than the OECD system most of the parties apply. We have, with this diversity of applied approaches, seen that this can impede comparability of contributions. We have also seen a broad application of non-concessional instruments accounted for with face values. We have seen potential overcounting in some cases of climate relevance for activities tagged with the significant Rio marker, and also an unclear attribution of private finance flows. So this all resulted in highly contentious issues in the context of the 100 billion. And such shortcomings could be mitigated for the post-2025 goal through reflecting those lessons learned and take into account, for example, to agree on a common definition of climate finance and eligible activities, and also taking into account this smoldering discussion on the role of indirect mobilization of climate finance. What could also be improved is more precise guidance on applicable accounting methodologies that would facilitate a more homogeneous tracking of climate finance flows. New modalities could also provide criteria for appropriately differentiating the finance flows and therefore avoiding double counting. We know the OECD in its reports invests a lot of effort to avoid this risk for their reports, but this is not really applicable for frequent reporting. Hereby, for example, more disaggregated information at the project level might help. Also, negotiating minimum benchmarks for financial instruments to qualify actually under the UNFCCC as appropriate for international climate finance flows might help. The ODA definitions of the OECD might serve here as a methodological example how to operationalize such minimum benchmarks. And we have also seen some former decisions, such as the significant share of new multilateral funding for adaptation that should flow through the Green Climate Fund, that those decisions have rarely been realized, the new goal might give an opportunity to more precisely define the role of challenges, including bilateral, multilateral, and private sources. And I think Sven will offer an example how to potentially operationalize that in a minute. And then finally, there is the question of the contributors, who will be contributing and who will be the recipients of climate finance under a post-2025 goal. The Paris Agreement here says clearly that the developed countries take the lead. Therefore, the language puts the new goal in the context of a continuation of the previous mobilization goal, but it does not state it must be of the same nature. What we can interpret here is that financial flows will definitely be constrained to developing countries. And the post-2025 goal discussion is clearly about developed countries' contributions, setting no clear expectation that the goal would include contributions from others. But a challenge, of course, in this context is that the developed countries category is not as exact defined as the one we have seen before with the Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 categories. The latter is not, so this is not really playing a role in the Paris Agreement. Therefore, the question is, could additional countries be considered as developed countries? Therefore, they could also support and contribute. And finally, there is also the question whether contributions from developing countries might also lead to an increased overall goal. So that's also something one can consider. Yeah, that was findings regarding some of the technical elements, and now I would hand over to Sven to follow up on potential sub-targets of the post-2025 goal.
Thank you very much. Next slide, please. Yeah, so basically I'm introducing into another dimension of how to look at this, and this is basically about the idea of sub-targets, thematic as well as other ones. And on the one hand, we started off with the question, okay, what is it that the systems that are being used already measure? Because of course we shouldn't necessarily come up with something out of the blue, which is impossible to measure, or we don't have an idea how to measure. And of course, there's some good analysis there, what's already there. You may know that you have the OECD markers on adaptation and mitigation, for example, also the biennial reports, and in their national reports, countries already separate mitigation from adaptation, and there's a cross-cutting category. Of course, this has to be looked at within the existing limitations of the systems, and Mikkel alluded to some of those limitations in terms of counting methodologies. But basically, we have a system which in principle would allow for sub-goals to be tracked. What are thematic options? I think mitigation and adaptation are obviously the most, let's say, easy, or the easiest ones, or the clearest option, because of the existing reporting, because of the, let's say, mentioning of the categories we've already seen in the first phase of the finance goal, and maybe also because there is an understanding there are different needs are developing differently. I mean, on mitigation, you can have some reasonable expectation that, at least in many areas, the costs are further going to decline, not necessarily costs overall globally, because of course we also know we need to do much more mitigations than has been happening so far in developed countries, but that's not relevant for the finance, but in developing countries as well. In adaptation, of course, a lot of immediate investments in adaptation would yield benefits in the sense of reduced losses and damages, which can be to some extent at least prevented through adaptation. Then there are other, at least theoretical options. We listed loss and damage here because there is a bit of a discussion, not at the forefront necessarily, but whether also to look into a loss and damage finance goal. And we also bring this up in the paper. It's by far not agreed. I mean, if you listen to developed countries, you usually get the response that loss and damage is dealt with through adaptation. And if you translate this to the accounting, then you know where you are. But we might also see a situation, or there's also other arguments. We don't have a clearly defined definition of what loss and damage action means. And there are, well, overlaps with adaptation. There are areas where you can also make the case this is not the same as preventive adaptation. But just to flag here that this is a debate which is at least out there and might also require additional technical work and analyses apart from the political aspects. Gender equality, it's maybe not at the forefront of the discussion. But we included this here because, for example, the OECD also has a system which is similar to the climate markers of gender equality markers, and given this is also something which is getting increased attention. In principle, it would be possible to say a certain share of finance, for example, should pursue gender equality at least to a secondary goal or as a principal goal. And these could, of course, also be combined. I mean, it's not about X percent or X billion for mitigation and then the rest for gender equality, but you would look at it as cross-cutting. So this is just to show options. There is also some guidance, or you can interpret it as guidance in terms of the different instruments being used or what additional questions might be triggered. Article 9.5 of the Paris Agreement specifically mentions the context of considering the need for public and grant-based resources for adaptation, in the context referring to groups of particularly vulnerable developing countries. I didn't put the exact definition here because, you know, there's a broader debate on how to look at particular vulnerable countries, but in principle, there's some reference there. This brings up a geographic question, whether we need some sort of geographic distinction of a sub-goal of sub-goals. You can look at various examples. You can think about the UN regions. You can think about these groups of particular vulnerable developing countries. You can think about LDCs, but it's of course a very different layer than the thematic one in terms of mitigation or adaptation. But you can also think about, well, would it really make sense to have on a global level defined numbers for different regions, or is that maybe something to better leave to the different funds to sort out? I mean, the GEF has a certain allocation framework. The GCF doesn't have like a country-specific system, but for example, a certain allocation of the adaptation resources to groups of vulnerable countries. So just to mention, these are also things one may look into. And then there's the different financial instruments, and reflecting on Article 9.5, you could argue that, okay, for adaptation, maybe we need to have a specific grant type target, whether it's then grants only or grants including grant elements of concessional loans could be a separate discussion. But this is something which you could also think about differentiating, and private finance mobilized as an additional sub-goal might also be interesting from the perspective of Article 2.1c, so that you could establish that with a certain targets of grant finance or of public finance, certain amounts of private finance should be mobilized. These are just different options to play through. Next slide. So basically, this is a bit of a summary, and please don't look at this as the proposal, but it's just an attempt to bring together these different dimensions in a bit more structured way. Let's assume mitigation and adaptation as the most or easiest options for thematic sub-goals. And you could distinguish then also, for example, grant-based or grant equivalent targets from those which are a bit beyond, for example, mobilized through public finance or even a broader set of private finance flows. And I think we also generally know that in mitigation, there's a bigger potential than in the case of adaptation in terms of really focusing where support should go. In adaptation, in the grant-based element, you could apply, for example, a certain quota or amount to allocate or earmark to groups of particularly vulnerable countries according to 9.5. You could think about cross-cutting goals. I think it's a bit a challenging area. There, of course, often overlaps between mitigation and adaptation, and in the GCF, for example, cross-cutting is applied, but not in a very clear manner, I would say. There might be a discussion about other thematic goals. I didn't put access here, but as the debate is much more open. And then you could think about sums, 100 billion plus, for example, could be one way of looking into the grant-based only, maybe added by a target for mobilizing through public or mobilized private finance. So just to give you a bit of an structured approach to this, as I said, this is not the proposal how it has to be or what we're necessarily advocating for, but to give you a bit of the lay of the land. Next slide. I'm coming now to summarizing the conclusions and recommendations and trying to do this a bit more quickly. On the process for the post-2025 goal, what we think would be a good approach is to design a work plan for defining a new collective goal and potential sub-targets in a timely manner. There are areas which we also outlined where further technical work would be needed. So it's not only a political question, and you should, of course, do the technical work first. It should be an inclusive and transparent process, which is not just by a group of countries defining what the goal is, a select group. This could be based on elaborating common understanding of the Katowice decision and on these different aspects. Clearly, there are linkages to other processes and bodies under the Paris Agreement and the Convention, and a work plan could also detail what the contributions of those other bodies would be. And then, of course, initiating a starting point for the real negotiations, so to say, for example, a technical report, which can then draw into key questions, and on that basis, the real negotiations might start. In terms of elements, of course, there's issues to look into, like the alignment with other relevant processes, for example, the NDCs, which there hasn't been a clear link yet. Potentially looking into a multidimensional target, which is more than just a number. There's a chance to improve the accounting standards, which could, of course, also increase the confidence on the whole approach, and also the confidence of those who are delivering, basically. And there's at least potential for a broader discussion on, okay, how do we look at the donor base? And I know this is a politically sensitive issue, but it doesn't mean, for example, that even if you would expand the donor base by other countries, that all countries would be in the same bucket, so to say. And you could even distinguish that and maybe even come to additional or larger targets. Next slide, please. Okay, yeah, I thought we had another one, but that's good. So yeah, that's from our side, leaving you with some of the summaries and conclusions and a lot of food for thought. So I think we're handing now over to the Q&A, and Björn, you are managing that, right?
Exactly. Thanks a lot, Sven, Michael, Raju, and Lena, for your inputs. I think that was really inspiring. And yeah, as you said, Sven, a lot of food for thought. So while everybody is chewing on that, maybe there is already some ideas for discussion, some questions. So if you want to discuss anything, if you want to ask our speakers, if you have anything to share, then now is the chance to do so. And you could either raise your hand or write in the chat. There is something in the chat coming. Okay, so Jörg Staudemann is asking whether we see the upcoming determination of the needs report as a chance to improve accounting methodology and or segregated targets. So the Standing Committee needs determination report and as a chance for informing the future target. Who wants to take that one? Is that something for Sven maybe?
Sorry, I was muted for a second. Yeah, I'm happy to take that up. I mean, I think it would definitely be an important element and increase the credibility of the discussion around the target. And in my perspective, there has been too much resistance of looking into the determination of needs and really understanding needs on developing countries. I know there are many methodological issues. But I think it would give us a better basis and have a more informed conversation about the needs for different types of targets. And then also, if there would be then different types of targets on that basis, it might also make it, I think, easier to pursue those targets in a more differentiated approach, and which I think even from a donor perspective might be of interest and can help the overall approach.
Okay, thanks, Sven. So now we're getting a number of further questions. So we're doing them one by one. Peter Luden is asking, is asking about the possibility of scaling up finance, and maybe Michael, is that something you could answer? Scaling up finance in general. Maybe we could also reflect on the next one, which also goes on the source of linking Article 9 and 2.1c and the feasibility of that. Maybe that all goes in the same basket.
I'm sorry, Björn, would you allow for me to explain the question verbally?
Ah, there you are. Perfect. Of course.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thanks to Sven and Raju for their really interesting presentations. So my question is about basically a comparison with the old 100 billion target. Would it be possible to set a new target and from the beginning, possibly in order to sell it easier to donor countries, to draw some sort of line from the bottom level of 100 billion to the new goal, and what the time frame then would be, and if that would be acceptable to developing country parties? What do you think?
So just to get that right, you are referring to a kind of ramp that displays or defines certain interim targets until the new goal is achieved.
Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, that was one of the options that we presented. I mean, if you have a longer time span and longer time frame for the new goal, let's say 2035 or 2040, I think it will be very much needed that you have interim targets to create trust in the target, because we didn't have that on the way to the 100 billion goal by 2020. Therefore, a new target would definitely benefit from that, and also taking into account these disruptive events that can kind of influence the overall needs, and also the message of the originally defined goal over a long time span. This can change completely the picture after such an event, such as the pandemic right now, and therefore interim goals would be, I think, a good choice, and also linked to the process that these interim goals might be readjusted after events such as pandemic we see right now.
Thank you very much, and sorry for making you repeat some of your presentation.
Well,
thanks a lot. I think sometimes it's good to have information double, then it's more sustainable. Okay, do we have further questions directly? Otherwise, we have something in the chat. Is there someone? Okay, then I read out what Charlene Watson asked. She wanted to ask whether it would be conceivable to link Article 9 and Article 2.1c in order to reach a required transformation. Is that something you want to say something on, Michael?
I can briefly respond, and maybe the colleagues can also jump into that discussion. When we developed the policy brief, we also, of course, took into account this linkage, which was decided in Katowice, where it's particularly even mentioned in the text, in the wording. Therefore, we assume that this might be an important element for discussion over the next months and potentially years, how to link actually Article 9 and all the climate finance, international climate finance elements to Article 2.1c. However, the debate is so broad, I would actually invite the whole group here to maybe share your views on that, because we have not a clear feeling in which direction this might go. It's something we thought about, and it definitely takes more time to think properly around the implications by linking that. Maybe you can even, Charlene Watson, share your view how you could think about an operationalization of this link. maybe my colleagues also want to join in this discussion.
Yeah, Sven, maybe Sven, you raised your hand. I will try to allow Charlene as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an important question, but I think the how and what you want to achieve with that is most important. I mean, on a narrative level, of course, they are kind of linked. But I would also think it's not, or I can only see this in the context of a differentiated target, right? I mean, I don't think we would politically gain a lot and sufficiently reflect the perspectives, also the legal basis of those who have to contribute and those who are recipients, if we just end up with a very broad target which says, okay, this is a number, this includes everything, but rather with one target which is really focused on public finance delivery, and then maybe in addition has elements around, okay, this is how we want to shift the financial system and including through financial flows to developing countries. And I mean, you could even think about things like reducing financial flows which support fossil fuel expansion to zero as part of the target and providing support for that. So I think there are different options, but I would argue it has to be part of a differentiated approach where the role of public finance from developed countries is clearly recognized and well separated to a certain extent. Thanks.
Yeah, Björn, let me just very briefly come into that. I'm agreeing to what Sven just mentioned. I think the 2.1c and the Article 9, if you see the way they are placed is a very different political game. If you see Article 9, it's more about finance and there's a certain obligations, who gets, like how it's provided and, you know, the way it has to be communicated and so on and so forth. I think there is a clear distinction on what that is. But if you see where 2.1c is in the objective of the Paris Agreement, where it's the overarching aspect. So that is more of a political, and it doesn't say who is giving where and how that. It just talks about making the financial flow consistent with the low carbon and climate resilient development pathways, right? In that particular context, what it also means is it is so vague that the onus or the accountability could also fall on many of the developing countries. I think that is where the fear really comes from. What does that making financial flow consistent with the low carbon and climate resilient development really means? Because if you see in the SAPA of that, it's more talking about ending poverty. It is about eradicating poverty, addressing food insecurity and so on and so forth. So I think with that distinction, if that until and unless the 2.1c is not clear on what it really means, and then by that confidence of the developing country to say that, okay, actually, this is what it means. For instance, let me just give you an example. When recently the Green Climate Fund passed this updated strategic plan, and one of the very controversial issue in that strategic plan was this 2.1c trying to be linked to the process in the GCF process. It means that, you know, it would go into a very lot different direction until and unless we have a clarity on what that 2.1c means. Unlike what is in the Article 9, the way finance is very clear on that part. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, colleagues. Indeed, a very not easy but very interesting topic. We have received a couple of responses here also on this topic. Jörg Staudenmann, I'm not sure if you can unmute yourself. Otherwise, we have to enable you if you want to contribute in speaking.
I can try.
Yeah, we can hear you. Perfect.
Thanks.
Perfect.
No, I think, I mean, we clearly see climate finance as only one small part of the whole finance that needs to be brought, you know, in line with climate targets. The 2.1c, Article 2.1c, it's only that part of funding that needs to be borne or mobilized by the North, let's put it this way, being spent on measures in the South. 2.1c is all kinds of finance. It's finance also within the developed countries, within developing countries as well, etc. So Article 9 is just the very specific part of the finance that needs to be, in addition to all other finance, being mobilized to help and support SDC, LDCs or SIDS and small countries. So it shouldn't, if they are being brought together, it clearly must go hand in hand with the differentiation of what kinds of funding for what kinds of purposes and what types of funding. Is it grants, is it loans, etc. This differentiation must be done then. That's our view. Thanks.
Okay, thanks much, Jörg. We have a statement from Matthias Söderberg. Matthias, do you want to unmute yourself, or shall I read it out?
You can read it. Well, I can say it now. Yeah, my concern is only about the general ODA levels, because as we know, we have the principle of new and additional, and there are very different interpretation of new and additional. And I'm afraid that we will see more crowding out of ODA in the coming years when the focus on climate change increases, because ODA is used for climate change. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, okay, certainly. Is anybody wanting to respond to this? Or we can
just very briefly on that part is, of course, that the fear is on that very particular aspect, that whether a lot of the especially in the developing countries or in the SIDS and LDCs, when development actions and the adaptation actions or the loss and damage, which overlap, are being dealt together, then there's a high chances that the double counting is, and in fact, it's already happening. Well, I mean, if you just take I think one of the analysis that we'll have to do is, this year, OECD DAC came out with 2 reports, one on climate finance. We said, in 2018, it gave about $78 billion. And this is the year in 2020 it talks about. They also came out with another report from 2020, ODA report that talks about 152 billion were given to into development finance. It means that when you go to next year, and when the report of the 2019 is coming out in terms of finance, and when you overlap the finance of climate change and the ODA finance, probably there'll be quite a lot of overlap on that part. Maybe some kind of assessment could also be done to see how much was that actually overlapping on that. So just in order to avoid, and maybe this analysis would also help in the future of post-2020 setting the goal, I guess.
Okay, thanks, Raju. Good, Charlene has left, but she left also some further comment in the chat. And so if there's anything we want to continue talking to her, we can do that afterwards. Is there anything else from the group of participants or from the panel that you guys want to share with us in this discussion? Otherwise, of course, you can find the contact details of the authors in the publication. I have put the link in the chat. The policy brief is online as we speak. It became online, and so there's always a chance to follow up. I see no further indications from the chat or from the group of participants, and I don't know if someone from the panel wants to say concluding remarks or something. Otherwise, it does not seem to be the case. Okay, so otherwise, then I thank everybody for participating here. It was, I think, way too less and too little time for discussing such a huge topic. It will keep us busy. It's just about to start, and it will keep us busy over the next years. And certainly there will be more technical relevant issues to be discussed. We are all looking very much forward to the very interesting climate policy year 2021. I think for the whole climate policy negotiation universe, we hope that there will be more physical interactions, and that there will be a real momentum in multilateral climate policy, where we have physical negotiation rounds, where we have also major players rejoining the Paris Agreement, and hopefully putting some momentum also for climate finance. So yeah, we look forward to the further interaction with you guys, and we also, of course, hope that you enjoy reading the policy brief, which you find on cfas.info. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for attending. I'd like to thank the speakers, and I wish that you all stay safe and healthy and have a restful year, end of the year. Thanks a lot.